Good morning. I hope you are all doing well this morning, and I'm glad you're here. I hope that you are just excited. I hope that you enjoyed the singing, you enjoyed the songs, you enjoyed the words, and I hope that they mean something to you and that they connect you in your way to God. And I just hope that as we move through the service this morning, the songs, our prayers, the words from the Bible and what God wants us to see this morning. I hope that it all works in our hearts, works in our lives, and changes us and moves us a little bit closer to God, moves us a little bit closer to a deeper relationship with Him. And that's my desire for all of you. And I hope that when you leave through those doors, you are not the same as when you came through. That a little bit of you would have changed. Would have been drawn closer to God through what happens this morning. And so I'm Pastor Tim, and I'm the associate pastor here at Bethel, and I have the privilege to share with you this morning. I've been having the privilege of being able to share with you, and we've been working through the book of Galatians, and I love preparing. I love getting ready to share with you, and I love to see that what God wants to do through His Word in your lives and in your hearts. And so I'm confident that if you not listen to me, but if you listen to what God is saying this morning, that you will understand Him a little bit better and be drawn a little bit closer to Him. And so I hope that you're willing to do that with me this morning. And so as we listen to God this morning, as we open our hearts to Him, as we allow Him to work in our minds and our thoughts through His words, I would encourage you to use that communication card that Pastor Jerry mentioned, and then use the back of it and share your thoughts. Write down your questions or your prayer requests or whatever it might be that God is doing in your life, in your heart. Would you write those down? And then when we receive the morning offering, you would put that in the basket as it passes by. And if you're visiting with us this morning, that's all we're going to ask you to do is to put that card in. We're not going to. We don't need you to give us your money. We're just glad that you're here and that you're sharing this morning with us together. So, excuse me. So we are looking in the book of Galatians. We're getting towards the end. We're at the end of Galatians chapter 4, or we will be at the end of Galatians chapter 4 by the time we're done. If you're going to use the Bibles that we have provided, they're on the stools in the back. If you grab one on your way in, that's going to be on page 649. Page 649. We're going to look, though, at Galatians chapter 4. So if you have your own Bible, you can turn there. If you have your smartphone, you can go online, find a Bible app, or just use BibleGateway.com and look up Galatians chapter 4. That's where we're going to be reading from this morning. Verses 21 to 31, but to again summarize and give you a recap of where we're at, we've come a little ways now into the end of Galatians chapter 4, and so the writer of this book, Galatians, is Paul, and he's looking at Christians that he knows. He knows the people that he's writing this letter to, and he says, guys, you're scaring me. You may remember that from 2 weeks ago, where we left off in our study, that Paul said to these people, guys, you're scaring me. I'm afraid because of what I see here. Your focus isn't where it should be. You're building up what he's telling to these Christians, these people that he knows that he's worried about. He says you're building up lists around yourself of things that you do, and you think it's going to impress God, and you're building up lists of things that you don't do, and you think it's going to impress God, or somehow gain you extra standing with God, or even worse, give you a relationship with God, and it's scaring me. Right? You're putting all your time and energy in religion. Religion being like system of behaviors and practices and those things. But God doesn't want religion. He wants a relationship with you, and relationships are built on love. Right? And so he says, this is really, really making me worried. Religion isn't going to develop into a relationship with God. It's not going to develop into the relationship with God that you need in order to be a child, an heir of God, in order to inherit eternal life. Religion's not going to do that. Right, and so he's looking at that and he's saying, this is worrying me, and I'll tell you why it's worrying me, and I tell you why I can see it, because you've lost your joy, you've lost your excitement, your eagerness, your passion. It's not there anymore, right? That joy, that excitement, it pushes you deeper in your relationship with God. And so that lack of eagerness, it's led you to stop listening to the truth. You're not changing anymore. You're not allowing God's word. You're not allowing God to shape you and change you and adjust your thinking. You've become dead and static and not moving. You aren't changing. It's like you just can't be bothered anymore. It's the point that they've gotten to. And maybe Paul is really addressing some dangerous tendencies or trends that we each experience. And that's kind of where we left a little bit 2 weeks ago, that maybe we've thrown ourselves fully into religion as a way to satisfy God or as an attempt to develop a relationship with God. And so we've thrown ourselves into the behaviors and the practices, but we don't have that relationship. Good Christians do this, and good Christians don't do this. And maybe we've thrown ourselves fully onto that, right? Or we've lost our joy, and we've lost our enthusiasm, or we've lost our eagerness. It's that our passion, our excitement for God, it's not there anymore. Or maybe you never had joy, or maybe you've never had excitement for God in the first place. And maybe that's because you learned from the very beginning the behaviors and practices of Christianity, the religion, and never the relationship early on. And so that joy is maybe for some of us, it's never been there. That eagerness, that excitement, it's maybe never been there. Maybe we lost our willingness to change. Maybe that's some of us. Maybe we've lost our willingness or become resistant to hearing the truth. If that's any one of us, if that's ever been true of you at your point in life, or maybe you're just looking for a more dynamic relationship with God, maybe you just want to move on to the next step with God in your relationship with Him, in your life journey there through faith. If that's you, and I hope it is, Paul says, after he tells them, I'm scared, I'm worried because you're focusing on behaviors and practices, you've lost your joy, you're not changing. After he says all that, Paul says, I have a solution. I've got a solution for you. And it's in Galatians chapter 4, verse 30. Galatians chapter 4, verse 30. He says, I've got a solution for you. And we'll be looking at verses 21 to 31, but starting in verse 30, he says, here's a solution. Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance of the free woman's son. See? That makes sense, right? So, as simple as that. Get rid of the slave woman's son. So I guess my work here is done. I will see you all next Sunday. Just reflect on verse 30. It's easy as that, right? So we're good. But that really is his solution, right? That really is the solution that Paul gets to. The problem is, that makes no sense, right? Paul says a solution to having a deeper relationship with God, a dynamic relationship with God, to not focusing on behavior and practice, to restore joy, to change again and allow truth to invade your heart. He says the solution is get rid of the slave woman and her son. We're going to look and see what this means and why he actually gets to the point where he says this. Because those words we're going to discover are the key. Those words are the key to moving towards a dynamic relationship with God. So if you're looking at your life and you see a tendency in your life to focus on behavior and practice, but you long for relationship, this is for you. And I hope that longing for a relationship with God is somewhere inside each and every one of us. And if you'd allow that small part of you that longs for that, or maybe it's a big part of you that longs for it and just can't find it, then this is for you this morning. If your relationship with God lacks joy or excitement or eagerness or passion, then this is for you. If you sing just to sing and come just to come, then this is for you. If you find yourself resistant to change, or if change and application never fully take for you, then this is for you. And I hope that is all of us. The desire to have a dynamic relationship with God. So I'll say again, like Paul, get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. So here's the reason Paul gets to that point, why he says that. Because he is trying everything, every way he can imagine to get through to his readers, right? He's been very direct. Last time we looked at it, we saw he gets a little bit emotional. He's going to be very blunt coming up with them when we read the next couple of verses that we're going to go to next week. He's going to be very blunt. He's trying everything to get through to them, to say, please, I'm worried. And so he's trying every way he can imagine to get through to them. And as strange as it sounds, this is his solution, or the answer to his fears for his readers. This is the solution. And if you want a dynamic relationship with God, this is what he's saying, that I want for you. Here's a solution. And then he tells an abbreviated Old Testament story, assuming that he knows his readers are familiar with the story already. And so that's in Galatians chapter 4, verse 22 and 23. So we'll start in 21. He says, tell me, you who want to be under the law, are you not aware of what the law says? Now here's his solution. He tells them a story. Chapter 4, verse 22. For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of a divine promise. There it is. So he tells a story. He's like, here's a solution. Let me say it to you this way. And like I said, he's trying everything he can. So now he's giving them an example. He's giving them an illustration. So he tells us this Old Testament story. So to understand his application in verse 30, get rid of the slave woman and her son, we need to understand the story that Paul is referencing and then the metaphor he turns it into, which is, I was talking to my dad on the phone because I talk to him each week. I talk to him and we toss around our thoughts and things like that it's a lot of times about my sermons and things. And I said, the hard part about this one is when you preach a sermon, you give your own examples. But what's weird is to preach a sermon based on the example someone else preaches, right? And that's kind of what this is. He's giving an example, and so now we're basing our study on the example that he gives. And so we need to understand this story that Paul's referencing. And so this story centers around three people. Okay, the story that he's referencing centers around three people. Their names are Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. Now, those of you scholars in the room will want to correct me because the names change, right? But we're all going to agree for the sake of argument this morning that their names are Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah. The story really revolves around Abraham, okay? When we first meet Abraham, he's been living in northern Iraq for some time with his wife, his father, and his nephew. And there seems to be a pretty typical life there, as typical as you can get, with one detail that I'm sure that they've come to terms with by now, but that is that his wife, Sarah, is unable to become pregnant for whatever reason. So they're living with this family unit, right? His dad, his wife, his nephew, and it's a pretty typical northern Iraq style of life back in this day and age. The one unusual detail about it is that Sarah can't become pregnant. She's unable to be pregnant. And like I said, I'm sure they've come to terms with that. And I say that because when we learn about Abraham in the Bible, he's 75 years old. So they've probably known this for a long time, that Sarah just can't have kids. He's 75 years old. Not being able to have children would have been hard in that culture because respect and prestige came from family size, and your legacy was in your children. And so having a son was a really big deal for them back then. And so he's 75 years old now, and like I said, they've kind of come to terms with this. They've kind of understand it. And so it seems as though they've become a non-traditional family of sorts. You have Abraham and his wife living with their dad, and they have, in a sense, adopted his nephew, Abraham's nephew, whose name is Lot. And so Lot, then, is more or less going to be Abraham's heir, but he's not really Abraham's. And so at 75, Abraham's life takes a dramatic turn. God speaks to Abraham and tells Abraham, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. And so he says, Abraham, I need you to move. I need you to leave. You need to leave your dad and go. I'm going to show you a land I want you to go to. So go. And then he tells him this. He says, I will make you into a great nation. Abraham, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing to the people around you. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Wow. Okay. So Abraham heads off to the land of Canaan, which today we would call Palestine, modern-day Palestine. Part of it's Israel, part of it's Palestine. Now, God promises Abraham three things here as we see this story unfold. He says, Abraham, go, I'm going to do this for you. But as we see here, there are three things. But the one that really affects what we're talking about in Galatians is this promise that Abraham's family will become a great nation. Abraham's family is going to develop into a large, great nation. Later, God will tell Abraham that he's going to have descendants like the stars in the sky. Remember, he's 75 years old. And he's telling Abraham, you're going to have descendants like the stars in the sky. Go count them. You're not even going to be able to count how many descendants you're going to have. And when God tells him this, Abraham's nephew Lot has left him. So Lot went with them, but then he decides to leave them along the way. So when God is telling Abraham, you're going to be a great nation with lots and lots and lots of descendants, it's only Abraham and Sarah. I mean, they have slaves and they have like those things, but in their family, like the Abraham Terah family, they only have the two of them. It's just Abraham and Sarah. Lot is gone now. And so Abraham doesn't even have an adopted son at that point. And so he naturally asks God, how exactly is this going to work? This whole, you've piqued my curiosity. Go back to the part with the great nation thing, where lots of descendants. How is that going to work? Because I don't have a legal heir. My wife can't get pregnant. And so all my stuff is probably going to go to the slave that works for me. Like the person that's actually going to get everything from me is going to be a slave in my household. So run that by me again, how this whole great nation thing is going to work. And God says, no, I promised you. I promise that you will have your own flesh and blood son from your wife, and your family will become a huge nation. And the way God promises this to Abraham, we're not going to go into it, but the actual way God promises this to Abraham makes it clear that God has a plan, and all Abraham has to do is just trust God, and it's going to happen the way he promises him. There's actually a ceremony that God performs that is significant in that it guarantees this is going to happen. All you have to do is just trust and wait, and it will happen. And carry on life as normal. So 9 years later, we're still in Abraham's story to get the understanding. When Paul says this in Galatians 4, we want to know what he's talking about. And so 9 years later, Abraham is 86. I can do that math for you. Well, actually, that's 11, isn't it? Never mind. Abraham's 86 years old, so we'll call that 11 years. And his wife comes to the conclusion that they're running out of time. Hey, you remember that time God promised that we're going to have a son? You're 86, Abraham. It's been 11 years. So we're probably running out of time. One of us might die soon. So we should probably figure something out here. So she comes to the conclusion they're running out of time. Not to mention that, again, Sarah isn't able to have kids. Right? She's not able to have kids anyway, as far as they know. I mean, 86 years, well, not 86 years, but, it's been a long time, and they have yet to have any kids themselves. So she comes up with a culturally acceptable plan to get Abraham an heir. I say that because it doesn't sound like a great plan to us, but she comes up with a culturally acceptable plan for Abraham to have a flesh and blood heir. Because God said you're going to have a kid, but it's not happening for them. So the plan is that Sarah's Egyptian slave will become a surrogate mom of sorts. Sarah's Egyptian slave is going to become the mother of this heir. And so Abraham will conceive a child with Hagar, and hopefully it's a boy, right? Which it is. And that boy will become Abraham's heir, and bam, he's got a son. A son has kids. Long story short, a nation, and everything else God promises will fall into place. It's a perfect plan. That's the plan. So Hagar has a son, Ishmael. That's his name. And Hagar is the slave that is chosen. So Hagar has a son named Ishmael, and Sarah gets mad. Which you can kind of actually understand, right? You've been trying for how long? And you cannot get pregnant, and then I know you're going along with the whole we need an heir and God promises, but so Sarah gets mad, because Hagar has a son, and she gets so mad that Hagar takes Ishmael, her son, her baby, and she runs away, only to end up coming back to live with them. Albeit it's probably a little bit more awkward at that point when she comes back. 13 years later, so Ishmael, that son, is 13, 14 years old now in the story. God reminds Abraham that I haven't forgotten the promise. Remember, right, the promise is dependent on you trusting me that this is going to happen. You don't have to do anything, right? But carrying on with life as normal, and it will happen. I promised you. And so 13 years later, God reminds Abraham that he hasn't forgotten, that his son is still coming to him. And Sarah, at which point Abraham, who is 99, Sarah laughs. They laugh. Abraham laughs at this. He says, okay, all right, I'm 99 now. All right, I'm 99 years old now. Because they're thinking there's no way this is happening. And a year later, Sarah conceives. And she gives birth to a son, Isaac. And so Abraham has two sons now, Ishmael, who's 14, and Isaac, who's just a little baby. So they're 14 years apart. Apparently, Ishmael, the older one, has it out for Isaac because he makes fun of him a lot. It's recorded in the Bible that he mocks this little baby. I don't know what 14-year-old thinks it's fun to make fun of this little baby, right? Oh, big stuff, huh? 14-year-old taking it out on a 1-year-old. But he makes fun of him a lot because, he's 14 and Isaac's 1. And so Sarah says to Abraham, Abraham's wife says to him, chapter 4, verse 30, get rid of the slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Get rid of them. So Hagar and Ishmael, that firstborn, 14-year-old, they leave. Isaac grows up. Isaac, the baby, he grows up, gets married, has kids who have kids who have kids, and that family becomes the Hebrews. It becomes the nation of Israel. So, we've gone through all the whole progression there, right? So Isaac does become more or less, they have descendants that become a great nation. So that's the story, which is what Paul says in Galatians chapter 4, verses 22 and 23. I'm going to read that again. That's the story he says, but he only says it in 2 verses. He says, it's written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as a result of a divine promise. That's the story. He does a lot better summarizing it, though. It's pretty quick there in those 2 verses. And then Paul turns it into an allegory, an illustration, a metaphor, an example. Galatians chapter 4, verses 24 is where we pick up now. So now he turns it into an allegory. These things are being taken figuratively. So he says, think of this as an example, as an illustration. The women represent 2 covenants. One covenant is from Mount Sinai and bears children who are to be slaves. This is Hagar. Now, Hagar stands for Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present city of Jerusalem. I hope you're taking notes, because she is in slavery with her children, but the Jerusalem that is above is free, and she is her mother. So he goes through and tells, this is who this is, this is who this is, right? And actually, already it gets a little confusing, right? I'm like, wait, so she's a city she's a floating city? One of them is a floating city, right? Jerusalem is above, and the other one is, she's in Arabia, but she's not in Arabia, she's also... Right? So the other Jerusalem, it's getting pretty confusing. Verse 27, for it's written, be glad, barren woman. That would be Sarah. She's the one who can't have kids. You who never bore a child, shout for joy and cry aloud. You who were never in labor, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. Verse 28, now he's going to talk to his readers. Now you brothers and sisters like Isaac are children of promise. At that time, the son born according to the flesh persecuted the son born by the power of the Spirit. It's the same now, but what does Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son, for the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Remember, that's the key. That's the point. And remember, Paul is what his goal with all of this is. All this confusing metaphor and example and illustration, his goal is to alleviate his fear and his worry and say, I have a solution for you, right? For my fear is that you've become focused on behavior and practice, you've lost your joy, right? And you're not changing, and this is my solution for you. So I'm going to tell a story. So let's not get lost in the story, and don't forget there's a reason he's telling the story. There's a point he's getting to, and that point is verse 30. So in his allegory, he turns the two parts of the story, the part where Abraham has a son with Hagar and Abraham has a son with Sarah, he turns them into what he calls two covenants, which really the better way to understand that, I hope, is maybe think of it as contracts or plans, arrangements, right? Two arrangements to get an heir, right? Two plans. One plan through Hagar, one plan through Sarah. They're both plans to get an heir. Okay, that's what he said when he says covenant. That's kind of what he means. All right, so there are two plans to address Abraham's situation. So plan number one, Hagar, and he calls her Mount Sinai and he calls her Jerusalem. But Hagar produces slaves. Hagar is a slave. Ishmael, born from her, was born as a slave, more or less, right? So that's plan one, Hagar. Okay. Plan two is Sarah. At least she's not. Her name isn't said. Sarah's not named, right? But we know she's the other plan to get an heir. Sarah. He calls her Jerusalem that is above, who produces children of promise, Isaac. Okay. So I'm going to try to clarify it a little bit more for you too, to try to get to the point here. So Paul says one plan, Hagar, represents Abraham trying to accomplish what God promised through his own natural power and human ability. That's what that plan means. That's what Hagar represents. It represents Abraham trying to accomplish, the plan to accomplish what God promised him his own way, Abraham's way, through Abraham's power, through Abraham's solution, through Abraham's means. That's what Hagar represents. It represents his attempt to gain or accomplish what God said he would. The other plan, Sarah, represents depending on faith and God's ability to accomplish what God promised. So Hagar represents depending on man and their ability to get what God promised, and Sarah represents depending on faith and that God can get what God promised. That's what the two represent, the two plans, the two covenants, the two ways of getting what God said was going to happen. So basically, using the story, Paul says, look, here's where we're at. There are two ways you can approach Christianity. There are two ways you can approach addressing your sin. There are two ways you can approach relating to God. The first way is the most common way we look at it, right? You can do it based on what we would say self-righteousness. Right? You can approach God, you can approach and try to relate to God based on your own self-righteousness. Now, I don't mean arrogance and pride. We think of self-righteous like as one, right, self-righteous, and that's a self-righteous person, someone who's arrogant and proud, and they think the most of themselves and nobody else. They don't think they can do anything wrong, right? That's what we mean when we say self-righteous. But try to look at it this. It's a hyphenated word. Self-righteous. Right? Righteousness is another way of saying meeting God's standard, accomplishing. Self-righteousness is attempting to arrive at perfection or arrive at absolute goodness on your own merit. It is your self-righteousness, your own righteousness, your own accomplishments. It's self-righteousness. You are self-made righteous, right? Trying to meet God's standards on your own. Maybe we could say this way. Self-righteousness says, I am righteous because I fill in the blank. I am righteous because I do this. That's self-righteousness. I am righteousness because I. Self-righteousness. It's the behavior modification that we've been talking about. It's trying to manage your behavior with your rules and systems and then adding more practices. And it's all depending on you, your self-righteousness, your ability to make yourself righteous. You do it. Your own merit. That's self-righteousness. I am not, you can ask anyone that really knows me, I am not good with cars at all. When something breaks on my car, I can't figure it out. I go up, pop the hood, and I stare at it because that's what, hopefully, I mean, if something's like burning, then that's wrong. That's the problem right there. But when I hear something wrong, or I can tell something's not working, pop the hood, stare at it for a while, and then I call like Tim Fenton and say, hey, I have no idea what's wrong with my car. I am not good at all with cars. I can try. I mean, I can try to figure it out. I can do, right before I went to college, my dad, he said, hey, like when I say right before, I mean like the day before I went to college. He called me, outside. He's like, hey, let's go outside and look at the car together. So I did. He's like, here's where you check the oil. I'm like, well, this is good. All right, I'm set. I'm good to go. He's like, make sure you check your tire pressure. And that was my lesson in cars. Like that's all I knew about cars. I eventually got to the point where I figured out how to change my own oil. I could do that. I'm too lazy to do it myself, but I know I could do it. But so I can try and I can think about what's wrong with my car. And I can make all my attempts, right? Right now it's at the mechanics right now, and I could try to figure it out. I could give it my best shot, and I could work real hard at trying to fix my car, right? But I'm not going to do as good enough job as the mechanic, because no matter how hard I try and come up with my own ways of fixing it, I'm just not good at it. I'm just not going to be good enough at fixing my car, right? That is self-righteousness, thinking that I can do this and thinking that I can accomplish it and make it just as good is self-righteousness. It's self-made, right? That's self-righteousness. And that's the first plan, right? That's the first plan that Paul's talking about. The first plan is accomplishing what God has promised through self-righteousness, thinking that you can do enough to fix this. You can do enough to relate yourself to God in the correct way. 2 weeks ago, we called that religion. Right? That religion, my behaviors, I manage my behaviors, I manage my practices, I am self-righteous, self-made. Right? And Paul says people like that, right? Those people that are, verse 24, right? People like that are children who are slaves. You go that route, and you're a slave. You're a slave to your self-righteousness. The second way that you can approach Christianity, that Paul says, is this other plan, this other approach. This Sarah approach is to place all your dependence on God. Right? It's based on God dependence. All the dependence is on God in that situation, and what He is able and what He is capable of doing. That's the second approach. The first one, Abraham and Sarah decide, we're gonna do this our own way. We're gonna do a man-made solution here with Hagar. The second approach with Sarah was literally all they had to do was wait, just carry on with life as normal and wait and depend on God. Right? It's God dependence. It's based on God dependence and what He can do, what He's able to do, what He's capable of doing. Trying not to do anything under your own abilities and trusting God to come through. It's God dependent through faith. It is my mechanic. I have no business trying to fix my car. In fact, there's a much greater chance that I will break my car trying to fix it than fixing it, right? I need to my car right now is with a mechanic, and when he tells me this is what's wrong, this is how I fix it, I go, great. Thank you. Because I depend on you to do this for me. Because I can't. I'm literally incapable of it. In fact, I'm just not a mechanical person. When we lived at our townhouse before we moved, our garbage disposal wasn't working quite right, and so I thought I'd take a look inside it. No, I didn't put my hand inside. Don't think that. I know more than that. Come on now. So I tried to unscrew it from the bottom and I definitely broke it. Like it was, before it was just making a funny sound. After, there was water pouring out of it. And I could not, so I called our landlord. I was like, hey, our garbage disposal broke. I told them I broke it, and they were gracious. They replaced it completely, and they didn't blame me. I mean, I blamed me, but all that's, I am not mechanical in any stretch of the imagination. Like, I don't fix things. I fixed our dryer one time, and I thought I was like the coolest guy in the entire world. And all I did was replace the belt on it, right? But I was like freaking out. So I'm not mechanical at all. But this second way is depending on someone else completely. right? Like I depend on my mechanic to be able to fix the things that I cannot fix. And if I try to fix it my way, I'm going to break it more. I'm not going to do a good enough job. And so we should. The second way is trying not to do anything under our own ability and trusting God to come through. It's God dependent. It's through faith, trusting Him and believing that when God says, "I'm going to do this, be patient and wait," that what He means is, "I'm going to do this, be patient and wait." Even if it's 20 some years later, if He said it, He's going to do it. He's going to take care of it. Right? And so if self-righteousness says, "I'm righteous because I," then this way says, "I'm righteous because God." Right? Self-righteousness says, "I'm righteous because I do, I make, I accomplished." But this way says, "I'm righteous because God. I've accomplished because God did it. I've achieved because God brought me there and got me there." It's allowing our relationship with Jesus to change us and move us closer and closer to God's expectations through desire, not obligation. Right? I am a better person. I'm a better Christian because God has moved me there, not because I have somehow accomplished something, not because I did something, not because I tried harder. I am righteous because God and my relationship with Jesus has moved me there, has brought me closer. And it's not obligation. It's because I love Jesus and I want to a little bit more. It's relationship. Paul says people like that are children of promise, meaning God promised and we believe it. And that's how we live our life, in faith. Children of promise, they've placed all their eggs in the basket that says, if God says it, He will do it and He can do it. And I'm trusting in this promise. I can think and I can try to fix things my own way as much as I want, or I can be honest with myself and say, there is no way I'm fixing this as good as He can, and just give it all to Him. And throw all your eggs in that basket and say, I'm not even going to try to fix this myself. This is up to you, God. It's up to you. That's the difference between Hagar and Sarah. The two covenants, the two plans, the two attempts. One represents Abraham's self-righteousness, and the other represents Abraham's God-dependence. They represent that spiritual battle that we all struggle with, right? Like Abraham, to varying degrees, we all struggle with this battle inside us. Like, how much do I depend on myself and what I can accomplish, and how much do I depend on God and His abilities? We all battle this to various degrees. Some, when it comes to that spiritual battle, have thrown all their efforts into self-righteousness. I will make myself a better person. I will be more good than I am bad, and that will impress God. And you've thrown all your eggs in that bag. You've thrown yourself fully into self-righteousness, and you can never, ever be as good as God wants you to be on your own attempts. I can do enough good things to earn God's approval. I can earn God's favor by doing this list of good things. And truth be told, that's where we all start. We all think that at some point in our lives, or continue to think that to varying degrees. That's where we all start, right? Like we said the 2 weeks ago, this is a basic principle of spirituality. It's a place where everybody starts in their minds. And if we stay there, it leaves us as infantile in our thinking. The basic principle of spirituality is this, that good works equals a good impression on a good God. If we can make it into the ABCs, right? Good works equals good impression on a good God. That's the basic principle of spirituality, and it's wrong. It's where we start, but it's wrong. Because Paul says it doesn't work that way. God is more concerned about relationship, not religion. Right? And He wants your love, not your lists. He wants to see us totally dependent on Him out of love so that we stop depending on ourselves at all. That's called faith. It's called trust. But because it's a basic principle of spirituality, that good works equals a good impression on a good God, then it's where we all start with our understanding of God, and we carry with us various degrees of that idea throughout our life. We carry with us our habit of attempting self-righteousness. It's inside all of us because it's a basic principle of spirituality. And I mean, isn't that the struggle? Right? Greg Frank mentioned this last week. It's why prayer is sometimes our last resort, because we struggle with self-righteousness. That I can solve this. I can do this. I can make this happen. And we depend on ourselves instead of God. It's why that prayer is our last resort. It's an exercise and practice to depend on God. We have to practice it. We have to exercise that idea that I need to depend on God. God dependence is the way this works. Faith is the way this works best. It develops the relationship. But here's the thing. We go back to verse 30, right? Where Paul says, so what does Scripture say? So he tells that story, right? And remember, this is for a reason. He's not just telling a story so people fall asleep. He's telling a story for a reason. And so the reason is in verse 30, right? What does the Scripture say? Get rid of the slave woman and her son. For the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with the free woman's son. Right? Hagar and Sarah, those two approaches, they don't get along. Right? Those two approaches in relating yourself to God, they don't get along. In fact, Paul says you have to get rid of the slave woman and her son. You have to get rid of that because she can't share in the inheritance. Because there's one way to get the inheritance, it's through the promise. Right? The promised son. She cannot share in that inheritance. So now we know what Paul is saying. So we're using this metaphor, right? The metaphor is get rid of the slave woman and her son, but what he's saying is get rid of self-righteousness. Because self-righteousness will never share an inheritance with God dependence. Get rid of self-righteousness and your attempts to do this on your own because it won't accomplish anything and it won't share an inheritance with God dependence. Meaning your self-righteous tendencies will actually pull you away from God. Your self-righteous tendencies will pull you down and away from God. In fact, they don't want you to share in their inheritance. They prevent you from depending on God. In the story, Ishmael mocked Isaac and persecuted Isaac, it says. And so it got to the point where they said, we've got to get him out of here because this is ruining, it's pulling us away, pulling it down, it's ruining this. And he's not going to share in the inheritance. It's a problem. You cannot be both God-dependent and sometimes self-dependent. You can't be God-dependent and sometimes self-dependent, right? For me, knowing myself, I can't kind of fix my car sometimes and take it to the mechanic other times, right? I just have to take it to the mechanic and admit, I can't do this. It doesn't work. I will break things for them, and then they'll get there and they'll have more work to do. My trying to fix my cars is not helping. It doesn't work. Paul says that the self-sided nature will pull down your desire to be God-dependent. It's going to pull you away from God. And before you know it, you'll be totally focused on behavior and practice, doing just to do, going just to go. The joy will be gone, right? The truth will hurt, so you ignore it. You won't change. Everything Paul is afraid of for his readers will happen because you haven't gotten rid of the slave woman and her son. So he says, get rid of your self-righteousness. Get rid of this idea that you can somehow impress God or accomplish something that you can't accomplish in you on your own. Get rid of self-righteousness. Guard your faith, and that's what we actually called the title of this sermon this morning. And this is the idea that basically what Paul is saying is you need to guard your God dependence. You need to guard your faith like it's a treasure. Like that part inside of you, for whatever reason, says, God, I trust you with this. You need to guard that so it grows. You need to protect that treasure and kick out any tendencies that you have to be self-righteous, any tendency that you have to be self-dependent. It is the only way. Legalism, behaviorism, self-righteousness will always hold you back in your relationship with God and will prevent you from a meaningful relationship with Him. And that's the big idea today. That's what I really hope that you take away from this. In our church, in our personal lives, we need to wage war against our self-righteousness. In our church and in our lives, individually, we need to wage war with self-righteousness. It is unacceptable, and it will pull us away from God. They cannot live together. You cannot be mostly God-dependent and some self-dependent, because that some self-dependent is going to pull you away from that God-dependence. It's going to pull you away from faith. We need to wage war against that tendency to be self-righteous. Self-righteousness will pull our church away from a dynamic relationship with God. We have to fight legalism and behaviorism and cultivate and celebrate relationship and faith and love and genuine community. We have to guard the freedom that faith brings children who depend on God's promise. Guard it. Protect it. Wage war against what will take it away. Right? We don't need to accomplish what God has said He will do. You don't need to accomplish what God has said He will do. You just need to trust and have faith. And as individuals, we have to realize that self-righteousness and God-dependence cannot survive together inside us. Self-righteousness and God-dependence cannot survive together inside of you. One will win unless you do something about it. Self-righteousness, our rules and behaviors and systems and our total dependence on those things will pull us away from a dynamic relationship with God. We have to fight legalism in our hearts. We have to fight behaviorism in our hearts and the idea that we can impress God or we can get favor with Him through our actions. And we have to guard the freedom that we have as His children who depend on His promise and trust. We have to guard that. It is a treasure. And as Paul has already said, if I depend on my love for Jesus and my genuine relationship with Him, He isn't going to lead me into sin. If I depend on God, He is trustworthy, and He's not going to lead me into sin. Because sometimes we think if I do this, if I let go of some of these things, then I'm going to go down the wrong path, the wrong way, going to do the wrong things. But if we lean on Jesus and trust Jesus, Paul has already said this earlier in the book, He's not going to lead us the wrong way. So the answer isn't, when we look at our lives and we see, well, I'm focusing on behaviors and practices and I've lost my joy or the truth isn't changing me, the answer is not try harder. We think it is because we have this tendency to be self-righteous, to think that I need to accomplish me. But the answer isn't try harder. It's ignoring the tendency to try harder. And really, as weird as it sounds, the answer is love God more. When we mess up and we realize I just tried to do this on my own, I just went my own way with this and followed my own self-righteous tendencies, a lot of times we think, God, please help me to try harder, or I need to try harder not to do that. When really, maybe the best answer is to say, God, I need to love you more than this. Help me love you more. Develop that inside of me so I love you more than this. Because trying harder is self-righteousness, and it's not going to accomplish what we hope it will. But relationship with God absolutely will, because He's promised it will. And if He promises it, He will do it if we just trust Him and let Him do what He wants to do. So Paul concludes in Galatians chapter 4, verse 31. He says, therefore, brothers and sisters, we aren't, or maybe I should say should be, we aren't children of the slave woman, of the free woman. embrace God dependence. And you'll let go of your behaviors and your practices. And that joy will come in or return. And your heart will begin to change, and the truth will change your life. Pray with me. God, I thank you because you are faithful, you are constant, you are true, and it may seem like you've forgotten or we're waiting for a long time, but